Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will start by thanking Steve and Tatiana for the invitation, and especially Tatiana for some comments and improvements of my paper. Maybe following the introduction of our chairman, I propose to start with the strange noise. That is to say, the bad noise. That if you are focused on this kind of noise, you will obtain a crash landing. And the noise is to put the focus on the time as a private good. And you know the INRIX. INRIX, it's a company, and they mention every year in a report the fact that in Paris, in a lot of cities, car drivers are losing about 1 hour per day because the speed is very low in mile or in kilometer per hour. But as far as you put the focus on time, you are going toward a crash landing. And what I propose in the paper is to change the view, not to abandon the idea of time gains and speed, but to have to look at the trade-off between the time as a private good and the space as a public good, and how we can change the trade-off between the scarcity of time and the scarcity of space. And I propose to do that, to start with a microscopic approach of the consumption of space by car, and then a macroscopic approach at the region level, as we did yesterday, and then to finish by some proposal about the regulation of urban mobility and some policy package. So maybe another strange noise we have in the landscape of mobility today, it's about shared mobility. I am not against shared mobility, but to some extent, shared mobility is a strange noise. Because when you look at the speeches from Uber, from Lyft, from the free-floating system and so on, they are speaking to the individual. We promise you to reduce the travel time, to reduce the travel budget, and so on. So with new apps, new platform, it's possible for you to save time. So why not? I think that when Steve is going to the station, he is using a free-floating electric scooter and is saving time. Okay. But from a collective point of view, we have to look at the results of the new mobility services in terms of the consumption of space. And then we have in this building, we have the studies done in Lisbon, in Helsinki, in Dublin by José Viegas and some colleagues. With electric and autonomous vehicle, it's possible to reduce congestion, pollution, travel time, and so on. But it's like a magic wand. If we look at what we have today, maybe it could change. But when we have today, it's a table proposed by Georgina Santos, my colleague from University of Cardiff. She is from Argentina, but she is working in Cardiff. And it is in a report we produced in last September in Brussels. We have 4 models of shared mobility. The model 1 is the peer-to-peer car rental. The model 2 is the car club. It's car sharing. The model 3 is ride-hailing, mainly Uber, for instance. And the model 4 is ride-sharing. And the 3-4 models are not changing anything. Because exactly like Aude was mentioning yesterday, a car is a car. Whatever the car, the consumption space is the same, maybe a little more for the SUV. But the consumption space depends not only on the surface of the vehicle, but on the number of people inside the vehicle and the distance between the two vehicles. And a SUV or a small vehicle with the same speed, the distance is the same. So the consumption space is not only the surface, it is the consumption in terms of space, hour. It depends on the speed, the rate of occupancy, and so on. So we can have a reduction in congestion, pollution, CO2 emission only if there is a large switch from solo trips to ride sharing. And I think that in some cases, the promoters of new mobility services are making a kind of greenwashing. We are the solution to save the planet. I am not sure that it is the case for a lot of new mobility services, maybe for some of them. And you all know the studies done in the US about the impact of Uber and Lyft on congestion in San Francisco, in New York, and so on. So we have to be careful with this stringent noise of we have the solution for you as individual. We have to put the focus on the consumption of space. And then we have to go back not to the future with shared mobility, but to go back to the past. And a well-known guy in France in the 60s, Mr. Merlin, produced this idea of the space-time consumption of transport mode, depending on the rate of occupancy, the surface, and the speed, and because of the safety distance between the vehicles. And clearly, for the pedestrian, the consumption in terms of square meter hour, it's not per hour, it's like vehicle kilometer, and it's a multiply. Square meter hour, it's 0.3 for a pedestrian, it's 1.8 for a car. Almost the same than a motorcycle. Because the motorcycle, the surface is less than a car, but because of the safety distance between the two, it's a little more. So the difference, what is important is the last column, that is to say the difference, that is to say for a motorcycle or a car, it's 5 times more space consumption than pedestrian. So clearly, we have to put the focus on the consumption of space. And then it is the same result than presented by Sophia just before. The car park is also a consumption of space. And then, just to finish this first part, the result for public policy is to reallocate the public space. And you have just here the example of the tramway. We had a big quantity of light rail in Paris before the Second World War, and then no more tramway in the 60s, and now you have in blue all the new line, and you have even a new line here. And you have just an example here of what was possible to do before and after the tramway on what we call the Boulevard des Maréchaux. It is the first ring. You have 2 road rings. The first one is now occupied mainly by tramway, and then very close to this ring, you have the motorway ring, what we call peripheric. And what is interesting is that when they decided to create this tramway line in the south part of Paris, it was possible to use a former rail track, fully empty, available. But they decided not to put the tramway on the former rail track, but to put the tramway on the road, just to push away the cars and the road traffic. So clearly, it is a first step, a first component of what I call the accessibility turn. And I will present what is accessibility term in the second part, maybe a little longer. So about accessibility, we have to come back to the seminal paper of Walter Hansen, published 60 years ago, making giving the definition: accessibility at point I to particular type of activity at point J is directly proportional to the size of the activity, that is to say D, and inversely proportional to a function of the distance separating the 2 points. And in the paper of Hansen, clearly Hansen is putting the focus on the second part of the equation. if you can reduce the travel costs, you living here or there, it's almost the same. So you can reduce, you can develop the urban sprawl. The cost is not very, very important. So clearly, we have to remember that we have two ways to improve accessibility. And as mentioned yesterday by Phil Goodwin, it's better for a urban planner to have reasoning in terms of accessibility and not only in terms of mobility. And suppose that you decide to reduce a lot the cost of mobility. What is the result? Here you have the city of Lyon, where is my institute. So here, inside the green border here, you have the what we call the Lyon metropolitan area, 1.3 million inhabitants. And you have three circles, the first one 25, the second one 50 and 75 kilometers from Lyon. And a little more than 2 million inhabitants. You have here the daily distance of people living in different places. And mainly it's white. That is to say, the daily distance to go from home to work was less than 5 kilometers. This was in 50 years ago. And this is the situation in 1990, and this is the situation in 2011. You have a lot of people, all these people living here, what we call Plaine de Lyon, they are making between 17, 20, and sometimes more than 25 kilometers to go from home to work. And it is exactly what was mentioned by our chairman yesterday. The people living there today are not the same than 40 years, 50 years ago. The people here were pushed away from the city center because of the price of land, because maybe they have a dog, or maybe some children, and they want a small garden. And finally, their revealed preference, subject to the constraint of the revenue, of the position of maybe the grandfather and the grandmother for the children, maybe the location of the job. The real preference is we prefer to go outside the city. But the result is a rather good accessibility for them, clearly because the cost of oil, the cost of a car has been divided by 4 in 50 years in France. If you take the minimum wage, with the minimum wage today, you can make 4 times more kilometers than with the minimum wage 50 years ago, before the oil shock. So clearly, because the abundance of car mobility, you have an overconsumption of car mobility. So what I call accessibility turn, obviously it is in line with what John Urie mentioned as the mobility turn. The previous map is the result of the mobility turn, because the mobility is less costly, is very easy to move. Immediately you consume more and more space, because you have not to forget the works of Zavi, Jacob Zavi and Antti Talvitie more than 40 years ago, almost 40 years ago, in the World Bank, about the fact that if you can increase the travel speed and reduce the cost, you will go faster, but also with a longer distance and in sometimes longer travel time. What I call accessibility turn is to say, okay, maybe we have not to put the focus only on the travel cost. And this is not exactly the equation given by Hansen. It is the equation given by my colleagues working on accessibility. And they say that for urban mobility and short distance travel, the impedance function here is a negative exponential. A negative exponential, that is to say that as soon as you reduce a little the travel costs, you increase a lot accessibility. And it's why urban planners, traffic engineers, were focused on this idea to reduce the travel time and to increase the speed, with the result we have just seen. So what I suggest is maybe we can have an accessibility turn. Once again, I am not against speed and so on, but we have also to look at some other components of the accessibility definition. This beta parameter, this is coming from the revealed preference. And maybe you know that the beta, if you look at you try to calculate the beta parameter for people using public transit, the beta in France is higher for male than for female. That is to say that female are less reluctant to use the public transit than male. Why? Because a lot of males, they have the car. And to abandon the car, it's a very high cost, as explained in some previous presentation. So the first thing is how to change the value of the beta. And you can change that by high frequency of public transit, comfort, and so on. And more than reducing the price. What is important is not the free access to public transit, but is it comfortable? What is the frequency, the reliability, and so on. And the second way to obtain an accessibility term is to put the focus also on the density, the attractive masses. So what I propose is to change the trade-off between reducing the cost and increasing the density. Not to abandon the idea of cost, just to change a little the trade-off of urban planners and the trade-off of individuals. So the first component of the accessibility terms, it's when accessibility gains are researched by the development of public transit supply. So it was already done some years ago in a lot of countries, instead of road building or enlargement. You presented that yesterday for Oslo. But a second component of accessibility emerged when land use issues are taken into account to promote proximity and density in relation with the development of public transit. That is what we call the TOD, not only in the city center, but also in the peripheries. Because even when you have a monocentric city like Paris, it's possible to have secondary nodes in the periphery, and here you can improve the proximity and the density. And we will see that in relation maybe with the emergency, the urgency mentioned by our chairman, it will be necessary now to go in the direction of other components. Just to look to the Paris case studies. You have the Paris in the middle. You have the first ring of inhabitants, 2 million in the central part of Paris, a little more than 4 million in the second ring, and 5 million in this. In the first ring, a little more than 4 million, and 5 million people in the second ring. And we will compare the model share of public transit and car. I remove walking, cycling, and so on. Between the so inside Paris, in 2001, the total motorized mobility was 3 million trips per day, 1.1 by car, 1.9 by public transit. In 2018, it was 0.5 only by car and 2.3 by public transit. If you add, that is to say, almost something 20%, but if you add bicycle, walking, it's less than 15%, exactly the figures mentioned yesterday by Todd Littman. So it's clear that within Paris, the accessibility turn is already there. We have the density, the proximity, very good public transit, except when there is a strike. But, okay. Now, if we look to the radial movement between the first ring and Paris. And it is the same change. In 2001, 1.1 million trips per day by car, and only 0.6 last year, and more for the public transit. And from the second ring to the central part of Paris, we have now 1 million in public transit per day, and only 0.3 by car. It's no more a problem. Even if you have congestion in usual day, it's not a problem. And you can see also a big increase in the share of public transit. It's less obvious for the movement between the second and the first ring. You have less car, but not a big change, and you have a little more public transit. The main difficulty is the last one, just at the bottom. You look at the movements between internal to the second ring, and you can see that it's more than 8.5 million trips per day by car. We have a little more by public transit from 0.9 to 1.2, but it's less. And it is the case where you have no improvement of the modal share of public transit system. And clearly, it's an issue we raised already yesterday. It is as if the city was a pyramid of sand, and the city is slipping into the fingers of urban planners. In the central part of the city, you are able to improve accessibility by public transit, proximity, density, but doing that, you increase the attractiveness of the city, and you increase the size of the pyramid, and then you have more people, the basis of the pyramid is enlarging. So clearly we have a problem with the control of the urban sprawl. And if you look at the results, all the mobility in the Paris region, 12 million inhabitants, you observe that the trips by car, it's today 14.5 million per day. And the trips by public transit, all the trips, it's only 9.3 million. So we still have more trips by car than by public transit, even if we have more and more by bicycle. And you can see that it's in French, but it's very easy. You have in red the vehicle kilometers, the bus vehicle kilometers in the second ring, and it's not easy to read. It's plus 33% more bus kilometer in some, and in the same time the demand was 39 kilometers higher than in 2010. And you can see that for the train in dark blue, on the metro, light blue, not a lot of increase in terms of vehicle kilometers, because the problem now is not inside Paris. The problem is in the second outskirts. Just another look to the Lyon metropolitan area, and we can observe that the movement internal to the road ring in 2015, only 26% by car and 25% by public transit. It's a good result because in 2006 it was 35% by car and only 20% for public transit. But you observe that external to the road ring, we still have a high level of car mobility. And why was it possible to obtain the result we have on the right? Why was it possible to reduce inside the city the number of car trips? It is because the decision done by the politician, local politician, is here you have the metropolitan area of Lyon, that is 1.3 million inhabitants, and it is the accessibility, the gravity accessibility to jobs, taking into account the speed, the frequency of buses. When you have a pink color, accessibility by public transit to jobs is better than accessibility by car. When you have a blue color, accessibility by car is better than accessibility by public transit. And clearly, the decision of was to extend some metro line, some tramway line, and so on. And here, in the central part of the city, you have a better accessibility by public transit. But clearly, it's only a small part of the region It's only a very small part inside. And if now we compare accessibility by car and accessibility by public transit, it is accessibility to jobs. So even in the central part of the city, because of the very high density of jobs, the accessibility by car is better than in the outskirts. But if you compare accessibility by car and accessibility by public transit, you see the difference. The accessibility is very good by public transit in the city center, but even if you have the train station are here in green. If you have a train station and some train lines, the accessibility by public transit is very low. So it's why the regulation of urban mobility, it's difficult, and we need some coherent policy package. Taking into account was what mentioned yesterday by Phil Goodwin, that is to say, we have had the peak car, but not a big decline after the peak car. We are close to a kind of bumpy plateau. It's not the traffic, it's the traffic per inhabitant. And here we can observe that with the decline of oil price in 2014, immediately we have had a rebound of the car traffic. I will skip this one. So if we want a policy package, clearly we have to have a look to the road and traffic management. It was the first part. The development of efficient public transit services, the development of new mobility services and shared mobility, especially when you increase the load factor of the car, the rate of occupancy, and we need land use management. And this is maybe the third component of the accessibility term. It was mentioned yesterday by Walter, the fact that we need a single mobility and land use authority as you have in Oslo. Because until now, the regulation of urban mobility is generally fragmented. At the urban level, we have a variety of public authorities involved in mobility, municipality, transport authority, region, and so on. And some of them are in charge of road, some of them are in charge of public transit authority, and so on. And the regulation of urban mobility must be unified and integrated in order to take into account the complex interaction between land use and transport. And this complex interaction, excuse me, I have to go back here. Okay. Clearly, we have to change the trade-off between scarcity of times versus scarcity of space. As an economist, no problem for me. I am working on the scarcity of times, scarcity of space, no problem. I can work about the two. But clearly, the scarcity of urban space is leading to stronger regulation of the use of public space. And then just to finish, maybe because of the emergency, the urgency of the situation, maybe a fourth component of accessibility term, the road pricing. But not only road pricing because of the road congestion in the central part of the city, but road pricing everywhere. Is it a dream or a nightmare? It's a dream for Steve Post. Unfortunately, he was not able to stay. Just to launch the discussion at the end of this meeting, this is an accessibility map of the region of Lyon. And this is the difference between accessibility by public transit and accessibility by car, with the following hypothesis here. The cost of public transit is 10 euro cents per kilometer for a passenger, and the cost of a car is 25 euro cents per kilometer. And what you observe is the difference. The difference is that nothing is yellow. That is to say, the car accessibility is always better than the accessibility. Even with the car, the cost of the car is twice higher, 2.5 higher than the public transit. So suppose that we have a kind of change. You said that the car is not paying the cost. You double the cost of the car. 50 euro cents per kilometer. And there you obtain some yellow position. That is to say, what's in yellow, the accessibility by public transit is better than the accessibility by car. The problem is that you have to double the cost of car. And maybe you remember the yellow vest last year in France, not with doubling, when doubling the price, but just 1 or 2% more of the cost of the. So, and another difficulties mentioned this morning by Todd is that public transit is receiving subsidies. So suppose that I introduce the public subsidies to public transit, because the cost is not 10 cents, but 30 cents. 10 paid by the users and 20 paid by the public subsidies. And in that case, even with 50 cents, 50 euro cents per vehicle kilometer for car, we obtain the same result than the first. And just to be very pessimistic, here I consider that thanks maybe to car sharing, you divide by 2 the cost of car. You come back to the 25 cents per euro per vehicle kilometers, and the cost of public transit 30 euros. And the result is this one. And according to some reasoning of some engineers explaining that due to the electricity as a power for the engine of cars, the cost of car mobility will be reduced in the coming year. So my question is, if you reduce the cost of car mobility, it will be necessary to have a very high level of road congestion pricing. Just to conclude, the car remains an important mode of transport in urban areas, especially in the periphery. But the domination of automobility is declining via the different components of accessibility terms. And the accessibility term is already a reality, but maybe you have to go further. The reality is the priority given to public transit and traffic calming, everybody knows. The priority given to land use optimization, proximity, density, and the end of public policies focused on time gains. It's not always the case. It is exactly what you mentioned yesterday about Norway. The difference, the consensus you obtain. Yesterday, Alexander mentioned the idea of consensus. It's very important. The consensus you obtain in Oslo, it's not the same that the consensus at the level of the country because of focusing on time gains. Unifying mobility and land use public authorities, it's not done, except maybe in some places. It's not done in Paris, for instance. And road pricing on the world road network, I let you decide. Thank you.